Thank you, Katie, very much indeed for reading for us. I've just been in Bangladesh for the last 10 days and teaching a group of mission workers out there who are involved in Christian work. And it's not often when I'm in a hostel or a hotel room that I switch on the television. I try not to do it if possible. But late one night in Dhaka, I got the BBC World News. And Gavin Esler was in discussion on the American court decisions regarding same-gender marriage. A very brave woman from the Foundation for Marriage, Sharon James, the BBC, and an activist from the United States. It was a very one-sided discussion. This last weekend, at least 3 friends of mine have been in the radio and TV studios defending the teaching of the New Testament on various ethical issues. It won't, I guess, have escaped any of our attention that just as our Chinese friends across in Beijing, so also we in the Western world are increasingly finding ourselves in the position of having to defend the Christian faith in the public sphere. An American friend of mine has just written this very helpfully. With pastors facing subpoenas for their sermons, and wedding chapels being forced to conduct same-sex services under the threat of imprisonment, Christians need a theology of defending themselves in the courts. We must not assume that defending ourselves strenuously and sometimes even defiantly before the governing authorities is inconsistent with being a follower of Jesus or antithetical to the propagation of the gospel. Now, interestingly, the issue of the closing 9 chapters of the book of Acts, the Acts, is a defense of the Christian message. The issue is first raised in chapter 19, verse 21 to 41, where the riot in Ephesus moves Alexander, a Jew, to go into the meeting place in order to, quote, offer a defense. Chapter 19, verse 33. The town clerk, who was a senior legal figure, equivalent, I guess, to a mayor, then suggests that the courts were open and that if the gospel needed defending, it should be done in a proper way in the courts. And from chapter 22, verse 1 of Acts, right the way through to chapter 28, we then see a progression of defenses of the Christian gospel. I've jotted the references down there on the back of the handout. Paul defends the gospel in front of the mob in Jerusalem. Paul defends himself in front of His Excellency Felix, the governor of the province of Judea, and his wife Drusilla in chapter 23 and 24. Paul defends himself before Porcius Festus, who was Felix's successor in chapter 25. And Paul defends himself and the gospel before King Agrippa, who was the king of the whole region, the king of Judea, in chapter 26. Here then, in these closing chapters of the book of Acts, we find Paul the Apostle defending, and offering a legal, a sociological, a political, a theological, a spiritual defense of the Christian message in the public sphere, before he eventually, we take it, has to defend the Christian gospel in front of Caesar himself. So the big question is a question which is going to be asked all over the world in this next half of the 21st century. Is the Christian gospel defensible? Are we just fanatical fundamentalists who are dangerous to society? Or can the Christian gospel be spoken openly in the public sphere? And Paul's answer, as we go through these chapters, is yes, it is defensible sociologically, it's good for humanity. Yes, it is defensible legally, it's not against the law. Yes, it is defensible politically, it is not a threat to the establishment. Jesus' kingdom is not of this earth, not a threat to Caesar. Yes, it is defensible theologically and spiritually, because it's exactly in line with what God has been doing for thousands of years, and Paul has God on his side. Now that ties in with the author of the 2 volumes, Luke Acts, and his stated aim. So in the first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel, those of you who can remember back to sort of 1903 when we started these series in Luke and Acts, in the first 4 verses of Luke spells out his aim, that we might have certainty concerning the things that we have heard. Certainty concerning the content of the gospel, certainty concerning the credibility of the gospel, and certainty concerning the communication of the gospel. And it's this issue of credibility that comes to the fore in the closing 9 chapters of the book of Acts. Is the Christian gospel defensible in its public proclamation in the TV studios and so forth, or at work? Should the human resources ban Christians from speaking about Christianity in the office? Or is it defensible to speak openly? Should we have freedom of speech or not? I did my theological study, for what it's worth, in Cambridge under, some of it, the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity. And on one occasion, the teaching of Paul, the apostle, was mentioned on a particular subject, and she snorted with derision. I don't know if you've ever heard a Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity snort with derision. It's not a pretty sound, but she held Paul's teaching in derision. Is Paul's message defensible? Now, it's hugely important because Paul's message is that Jesus is Lord of all, that everybody should hear the gospel, that Jesus is Lord of all and he offers forgiveness to all. Can we speak this openly in the office and in the public sphere? The section begins, however, before we get into the legal defenses, with a description of Paul's ministry during a period when Luke, the author, was traveling with him. And in chapter 20, Luke gives a positive defense, before we get to the courtroom, of the work of Paul. Twice Luke says, or Paul says, you yourselves know. You yourselves know. In other words, you've seen my ministry. This is what it's like. You know what I did. And you know that positively my ministry is defensible, and this is what it looks like. And so this week, and on the 2 further Tuesdays and Thursdays that we've got before we head deeply into carol service season, we're going to be looking at the positive defense of Paul's ministry and holding it up, if you like, as something of a plumb line against our own churches and our own experience of Christian ministry. Is what we're doing what Paul was doing? Paul says, you yourselves know what I was doing. It was good, it was right, it was Christian. Now let's hold up the plumb line and ask, is St. Helen's doing what Paul was doing? Is your church at home doing what Paul was doing? Because here is what authentic Christian ministry looks like. Now this week, just 3 very simple points. Paul's ministry was one of heartfelt encouragement, verses 1 and 2. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he'd gone through these regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece, and there he spent 3 months. And when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Now, what we see here is the Apostle Paul was prepared to travel considerable distances, face considerable danger, and place himself at considerable discomfort in order to encourage new believers and new churches. This is not a new pattern. At the end of the first missionary journey, Paul strengthens the churches by traveling to visit them. At the end of the Council of Jerusalem, they travel to the churches to strengthen them. At the start of the second missionary journey, Paul's intention is to strengthen the churches. As a result of the second journey, the churches are strengthened. And at the start of the third journey, he is going to strengthen the churches. And I've jotted the quotes down there for you. Here in chapter 20, verse 2, when he had gone through these regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. The word is a Greek word meaning to appeal, to entreat, to exhort, to encourage. And one commentator, John Stott, says this of this ministry of encouragement: it is a vital ministry in establishing Christian disciples. In fact, one of the things I do when I'm preparing to speak here on Tuesdays, I'll often look at several different translations to see what they make of the original Greek. I'm not a great Greek scholar myself, so I look at several different translations. The New International Version has this: speaking many words of encouragement. And that sent me back to the Greek, and the Greek reads like this: he encouraged them with much word. I like that. I mean, you can understand why they didn't translate it like that, but he encouraged them with much word as he went back and visited and revisited. And therefore, throughout Paul's ministry, in the face of real personal danger and discomfort, Paul was prepared to expend himself, placing his safety, his personal convenience at the disposal of the churches and at the disposal of individuals, as he sought to encourage with much word. His ministry then was a ministry of heartfelt encouragement. I wonder if that's the way you would sum up Paul's ministry. I wonder if you see the Apostle Paul as a man of much encouragement. What did they say when the Apostle Paul had been to visit them? We were really encouraged. Not we were seriously beaten up or we were harangued verbally. We were greatly encouraged. He did it by letter, he did it by personal visitation, he did it by special envoy. Consistently and repeatedly he did it through prayer. I guess had Paul at his disposal the technology of today, we would have been getting texts from him, tweets from him, emails from him, blogs, apps, and podcasts from him. He was a much word man, and his much word was a word of much encouragement. Now, I've been reflecting on this largely on aeroplanes over the last few days, and it struck me that this tells us something about what we need. We need to be encouraged through much word. If you stay away from Bible teaching and from Bible word ministry, you can expect to be discouraged as a Christian. If you distance yourself from men and women of the word, you will find yourself growing cold as a Christian. You know the rather quaint, I've never used it here because I think it's so quaint, but it can be quite helpful. The Scottish minister who went to visit a woman who'd been staying away from the fellowship, he sat down next to the fire, and there was a coal fire, reached with his tongs, took one of the coals out of the fire, and it just sat on the hearth, and gradually it grew and dimmed and dimmed and dimmed and dimmed. He said absolutely not a word. Must have been a Highland minister. Said not a word. And then after he'd been there for 10 minutes, he'd gone completely, all the flame had died out, reached with his tongs, put it back in the fire, and of course it blazed back into life. He got up and walked out. She got the message. You need the word of God, and you need much encouragement. You need the encouragement of much word in order, according to the Apostle Paul. And that, I think, has something to say to us for those of us seeking to establish strong Christian presences in our offices, which I hope many of you are doing. You're trying to establish a strong Christian presence in your office. It will require much encouragement from you of other Christians, much word. And some of you, men and women, have now made it through the first 5 years in the city. Some of you have made it through a great deal longer than that. But what of your ministry of encouragement? The establishing of strong Christian works requires much encouragement, much word. And St. Helen's has been marked over the years by Christian men and women seeking to encourage other Christian men and women in the workplace. I wonder who you are encouraging. This is also, it seems to me, immensely important, and this is the main point, as we consider the ministry of the Apostle Paul. He was, above all else, an encourager. Do you know, you get the impression from the way some people talk about the Apostle Paul that he was a sort of distant, removed, disinterested, dispassionate figure who emerged from his apostolic limo to deliver an apostolic verbal beat-up and then jumped back in his limo again and was off. No, Paul was a great encourager. My habit is to read a few chapters of the Bible every morning. Here is my reading from this morning as Paul wrote to Thessalonica and the church in 1 Thessalonians. We did not seek glory from people, from you or from others. We were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. Being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. Dispassionate, Paul, removed, disinterested, like a nursing mother. What does it require to see churches established and Christians developed in Christian living? Yes, we acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. Yes, we receive the forgiveness that he offers, but we need much encouragement. I do, and I'm sure you do as well. The second thing just to note is that Paul is a team worker and a trainer. And you see that in verse 4. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe and Timothy, and the Aegeans, Tychicus and Trophimus. Now this verse, I think, is fascinating. It shows us that Paul was no lone ranger, and it suggests that Paul had a deliberate strategy, which he later urges on us, for the recruiting, training, and deploying of workers for the advance of the Christian gospel. Now, these co-workers we read about elsewhere in the New Testament. Tychicus is mentioned in Colossians as a beloved brother and a faithful minister and a fellow servant. Aristarchus is mentioned in Colossians. He's described as a fellow worker. And Timothy is one of Paul's key co-workers. I have no one like him, says Paul. As a son with a father, he served with me in the gospel. And notice the geography of it in verse 4. 2 from Thessalonica, Aristarchus and Secundus. 2 from Derbe, Timothy and Gaius. 2 from Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus, and Sopater from Berea. It seems then, doesn't it, that Paul had a deliberate strategy of recruiting, training, and deploying men for ministry in order to ensure the advance of the Christian gospel. This should get us thinking very seriously if we are concerned for the advance of the Christian gospel in offices across London and indeed further afield around the world. It seems that the churches gladly devoted men to Paul in order that they be trained and deployed. And so Paul, you might say, was like a traveling theological college as he went with his band of co-workers, training them and deploying them elsewhere. Would you turn, please, to 2 Timothy, keep a finger in Acts, chapter 2, verse 2. For here we find Paul spelling out his strategy. 2 Timothy 2:2. Page 1197. 2 Timothy 2:2. We'll take it from verse 1. You then, my child, he's writing to Timothy, who we just heard about. You then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus. Now look at this. And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Now here we have a strategy operated by the Apostle Paul for gospel advance. He was a team man. He was passionate about training a team. Having trained his team, he deploys them. And there are 4 generations mentioned in that verse. Do you see? What you have heard from me, the Apostle Paul, Timothy, entrust to reliable men, 3rd generation, who will be able to teach others also. 4 generations of Christian believers and Christian workers. Now, this dispels another myth about the Apostle Paul. First, that he was not a people person. No, he was a great encourager. Second, that he was not a team player. No, he was every bit a team player. When Paul came into town, a whole group of people came with him, who he was in the business of training in order to deploy. He was not a one-man band. He was not a lone ranger. He didn't operate like Jason Bourne or Clint Eastwood, alone behind enemy lines. His motto was not, do as I say, not as I do. Paul says to Timothy, you have seen my life, my conduct, my aim, my self-control, and so on, and describes his own life. Paul's motto was, imitate me. He was in the business of training and deploying interns, second lieutenants, junior partners, co-workers, whatever you want to call them. This is what Paul was doing. And he ensured for the future of the gospel through intentional training. Now, I hope this helps to explain, for those of you who are regulars here, why you often sit next to somebody at St. Helens and you say to them, oh, where do you work or what do you do? And they say, oh, I'm an associate at St. Helens. We are in the business of training men and women for ministry all over the world, because that is the biblical strategy given to us by the Apostle Paul as we hold up this plumb line against his ministry. Currently, 2 brothers from Latvia with us. Next year, I'm hoping we might find somebody from Dhaka. We've got somebody in mind. At least 2 from France. Others have come from Singapore, Beijing, Australia, America, Kenya, Uganda, Brazil, and over the years, literally hundreds from the United Kingdom. They've gone to Vietnam, Cambodia, Japan, Melbourne, the United States of America, Beijing, Singapore, Kenya, Latvia, France, and Barrow-in-Furness, and other places in Britain. But more importantly, as we hold up the ministry of Paul and seek to defend it, this tells us a vital truth about Paul. This is authentic apostolic ministry. Here is what you and I should be seeking for our churches, that we be training a generation of workers. Can you picture the tiny church of Berea? Sopater was one of their best men. Can you picture Derby, from where Timothy came? Timothy, I have no one else like him who is concerned for your interest. But they're prepared to deliver them up for training so that they can be deployed for effective gospel work. Paul's ministry, one of encouragement. Paul's ministry, one of teamwork and training.